And often these wars repeat themselves. They become very predictable, both in terms of the propaganda that justifies them and that induces Americans to accept them early on, and in the ways in which the war progresses. And as we pointed out many times and documented with polling data, it's almost always the case that when new wars are presented, a majority of Americans from both political parties are induced to support the war using very intense emotional propaganda. But by the end of the war, whether it's 6 months later or 2 years later or 10 years later, Americans come to view the war as a mistake. That's exactly the pattern that this war in Ukraine followed, and it was very predictable and very obvious that exactly that would happen. I can show you many videos on this program back in February of 2022 when Russia invaded, where we went on the air and said exactly that was going to happen. I could see at the time how powerful the emotional propaganda was, showing Ukrainians weeping over lost loved ones or seeing their buildings that had been bombed. Obviously, that is going to move any decent person. The media always picks and chooses which victims to show, which victims to hide. That's a very powerful way to manipulate public opinion. But I could tell in the first 2 weeks that the emotional outpouring on behalf of Ukrainians as a result of the unified media support for Ukraine was so intense that it was going to be impossible to have any space to question that war and U.S. support for it for months to come. And I devoted many shows to just urging that people take a step back, that people understand that we're all emotional beings, but that our emotions, the decent emotions in us, can be manipulated, as they so often are, to get us to support things that are not in our interest or to believe things that are patently untrue. And most of the people, I was far from alone, who opposed the U.S. role in this war were arguing that Ukraine had no chance to win, that Russia was a much, much bigger country. Just on population size alone, there was no way Ukraine could keep up. They just didn't have the men in their country to go and fight on the front lines the way the Russians did. And Russia's just a much more powerful military anyway, even if NATO is behind Ukraine as it was. And it was clear that what was going to happen was Ukraine was not going to be protected as war supporters were claiming they wanted to do, but instead that Ukraine was going to be destroyed. Just like the United States helped destroy Syria in the name of protecting it, helped destroy Libya in the name of liberating it, helped destroy Iraq in the name of freeing it. There's just a whole long list of wars that show you exactly what's going to happen. And if you can just take a step back and breathe and not let yourself be emotionally manipulated by war propaganda, you'll be able to see exactly what you're being induced to do again. And the few of us in media who are standing up and saying this war is wrong, the United States is going to make things worse by supporting it and fueling it, that instead there should be diplomatic attempts to resolve this war instead of what seemed to be deliberate attempts to fuel it and worsen it and prolong it. All of us were called Kremlin agents or Putin apologists or being pro-Moscow. And it wasn't just we were branded that rhetorically, although we were widely. We were often put on official lists by the Ukrainian government. You can go to my Wikipedia page right now, and there's a whole section on there how I was formally accused of being a Russian propagandist by the Ukrainian government, which of course in Wikipedia world, which is a neoliberal propaganda arm, is meant to be incriminating. It's meant to signal to people that I'm some kind of Russian stooge. But I've never said a positive word about the Russian government in my life. I just opposed U.S. involvement in that war because it was predictable what was going to happen. And now here we are, almost 2 years later. The United States has spent $120 billion on this war. President Biden is now seeking another $60 billion. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives have been lost. President Zelensky is fighting with a conscript army. There are reports of the Ukrainian police and military dragging 45-year-old men now off buses and trains to send them to the front. People are fleeing that country knowing that they're being used as cannon fodder for a feudal war. And tens of thousands of people, 20-year-olds and 18-year-olds and 30-year-olds, have lost their lives when in the last year the front has barely budged an inch, while Americans were forced to send tens of billions of dollars more and more to fuel this war. And obviously, if I knew that Ukraine was never going to win, the CIA knew that as well. They didn't care about winning. Nobody thought that Ukraine was going to expel Russian forces from eastern Ukraine, or much less from Crimea. We were told that was the only condition in which the war would end once all Russian troops were gone, not only from the Donbass but from Crimea as well. Russia considered that an existential threat. They were never going to let that happen. They would fight until the last person and use nuclear weapons before they let NATO come right up to their border into Crimea and eastern Ukraine. President Obama always said, when confronted by neocons about why he didn't do more to confront Russia over Ukraine or Syria, he said, Ukraine is not a vital interest to the United States, but it is and always will be to Russia. That was before Russiagate and before anyone was allowed to speak rationally about the actual threat posed or not posed by Moscow. So, you have all this destruction, all this death, all this money wasted. And now you have articles like this one from Time Magazine at the very beginning of this month that is essentially Zelensky's own advisors pleading with him in the media to stop being so delusional and come into reality. Reality being that Ukraine has no chance to win. There's the headline, quote, "Nobody believes in our victory like I do. Inside Vladimir Zelensky struggled to keep Ukraine in the fight." Quote, 20 months into the war, about a fifth of Ukraine's territory, a fifth, 20%, remains under Russian occupation. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed, and Zelensky can feel during his travels that global interest in the war has slackened. So has the level of international support. Quote, "The scariest thing is that part of the world got used to the war in Ukraine," he says. "Exhaustion with the war rolls along like a wave. You see it in the United States and Europe. And we see that as soon as they start to get a little tired, it becomes like a show to them. Quote, I can't watch this rerun for the 10th time." Public support for aid in Ukraine has been in decline for months in the U.S., and Zelensky's visit did nothing to revive it. Some 41% of Americans want Congress to provide more weapons to Kiev, down from 65% in June, when Ukraine began a major counteroffensive, according to a Reuters survey taken shortly after Zelensky's departure. That offensive has proceeded at an excruciating pace with enormous losses, making it ever more difficult for Zelensky to convince partners that victory is around the corner. And remember, we talked about this a lot on this show, this idea of the counteroffensive. You had David Petraeus and Matt Boots' column saying the counteroffensive was going to be successful, it was going to transform the war, just like supporters of the Iraq War, once Americans got disillusioned with that war, invented the idea of a surge that was going to change everything, and it did nothing. And this counteroffensive has been a gigantic failure. It ended the lives of a huge number of Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers, and it barely moved the front lines. It didn't breach the Russian defensive positions, as was obvious it wouldn't. And now they're out of promises. The West is to a weary Western population. No more counteroffensive to promise. Winter is here. Quote, "With the outbreak of war in Israel, even keeping the world's attention on Ukraine has become a major challenge. Despite the recent setbacks on the battlefield, Zelensky does not intend to give up fighting or to sue for any kind of peace. On the contrary, his belief in Ukraine's ultimate victory over Russia has hardened into a form that worries some of his advisors. It is immovable, verging on the messianic. Quote, he deludes himself. One of his closest aides tells me in frustration, quote, we're out of options. We're not winning, but try telling him that. Zelensky's stubbornness, some of his aides say, has hurt their team's effort to come up with a new strategy, a new message. As they have debated the future of the war, one issue has remained taboo: the possibility of negotiating a peace deal with the Russians. Judging by recent surveys, most Ukrainians would reject such a move, especially if it entailed the loss of any occupied territory. That's because Zelensky, deceived by the West, has converted himself into a true believer that they can beat Russia, and he convinced Ukrainians that that was the case, and they marched into a war they were always destined to lose. Quote, in some branches of the military, the shortage of personnel has become even more dire than the deficit in arms and ammunition. One of Zelensky's close aides tells me that even if the U.S. and its allies come through with all of the weapons they have pledged, quote, we don't have the men to use them. Now recruitment is way down. As conscription efforts have intensified around the country, stories are spreading on social media of draft officers pulling men off trains and buses and sending them to the front. Those with means sometimes bribe their way out of service, often by paying for a medical exemption. Such episodes of corruption within the recruitment system became so widespread by the end of the summer that on August 11, Zelensky fired the heads of the draft offices in every region of the country. This war is a debacle. And Zelensky's own closest advisors are running to the Western press, to Time magazine, to try and denounce him for being delusional, to try and get through to him. Because everyone sees this except him. Here, the New York Times, November 2nd, Ukraine's top commander says the war has hit a stalemate. Quote, in a candid assessment, General Valery Zelensky said no beautiful breakthrough was imminent and that breaking the deadlock could require advances in technological warfare. This is, again, Zelensky's closest advisors announcing to the world, please help us. Zelensky is like a madman at this point. He refuses to accept reality. He continues to insist that we have to keep fighting this war, even though it's now definite after 2 years, including a very bloody and costly year where nothing happened, that this war is over, that there's no possibility to continue, that the only thing that will happen is more lives lost. And that the only rational solution is for Zelensky to enter peace talks with the Russians, even though Russia will now have the upper hand. Whereas 2 years ago, when the U.S. blocked negotiations and Ukraine could have had a much better deal, instead, we're now at the point where Zelensky has to hope, and the West has to hope, that the Russians will be satisfied with 20% or 18%, giving up a couple percent as a gesture, if they want, to end the war. Putin doesn't seem at all eager to end the war. The Russian military has gotten much stronger, much more fortified, much better financed. It's the West that needs this war to end, especially now that they have a new war. Finally, Zelensky seems to be accepting the reality because he gave a speech today in which he essentially was begging for more money and accepting the reality that the West seems unlikely to give him more. And so listen to what he said.
If you can't give us some financial support, okay, please give us a credit and we will give you back money.
Oh, it's okay, you can't give us any more money? Give us a loan, we'll pay you back. This is the most corrupt country in Europe. There's been immense graft and theft of this money in Ukraine. The U.S. Congress repeatedly rejected efforts by people like Ron Paul just to have an inspector general track and manage the money. Why do you think that is? Think how angry the American people would know if this money wasn't really going to, the war effort was going to Swiss bank accounts and other coffers of corrupt Ukrainian officials. And now here you have a Zelensky like a used car salesman in his sweater saying, give us a loan, we'll pay you back, just give us some more. Here from NBC News is the article that I think is probably the most devastating for the Ukrainian war effort. It's on November 3rd. Do you see how they came one after the next? The Time article was November 1st, the New York Times article November 2nd. Here's NBC News November 3rd. European officials broached the topic of peace negotiations with Ukraine, sources say. The conversations have included very broad outlines of what Ukraine might need to give The conversations have included very broad outlines of what Ukraine might need to give up to reach a deal with Russia. Now remember, if you suggested a year and a half ago, a year ago, 6 months ago, that Ukraine should give up part of its territory to end this bloody war because they would end up having to do it anyway, you were called every name in the book. An appeaser, Neville Chamberlain, a Kremlin agent, all of that. And now, here's Western intelligence agencies and Western governments telling Zelensky he needs to do exactly that. Why wouldn't they have done this back in February 2022 before all these people died and all this money was spent? The reason is they wanted this war to be prolonged. They wanted Ukraine to be destroyed. Think how much money JP Morgan and BlackRock, these vultures, are going to make in the rebuilding of Ukraine. Obviously, the West is going to pay for that. And think how much the Americans believe they weaken Russia. That's what they kept saying. Bill Kristol had that ad saying, oh, this is a great war. No Americans are dying. Only Ukrainians are dying. We're just paying the money and we're weakening our enemy, Russia. Never any explanation about why Russia is our enemy, other than the fact that they helped in their minds, in the minds of Bill Kristol and his fellow Democrats, Hillary lose and Trump win. But other than that, why do we need to weaken the Russian military? And why do we need to send tens of thousands of Ukrainians to their deaths to do it? But now you have these exact peace talks that those of us who have been saying this for 18 months knew were going to come anyway. And we wanted it to happen before all these people lost their lives and all this money was spent and Ukraine was destroyed, not after. Quote, the discussions are an acknowledgement of the dynamics militarily on the ground in Ukraine and politically in the U.S. and Europe, officials said. Quote, they began amid concerns among U.S. and European officials that the war had reached a stalemate and about the ability to continue providing aid to Ukraine, officials said. Biden administration officials also are worried that Ukraine is running out of forces while Russia has a seemingly endless supply, officials said. Ukraine is also struggling with recruiting and has recently seen public protest about some of Zelensky's open-ended conscription requirements. People in Ukraine are starting to get angry that they're forced into these front lines with no end in sight. Quote, and there is unease in the U.S. government with how much less public attention the war in Ukraine has garnered since the Israel-Hamas war began nearly a month ago, the official said. Officials fear that shift could make securing additional aid for Kiev more difficult. Some U.S. military officials have privately begun using the term stalemate to describe the current battle in Ukraine, with some saying it may come down to which side can maintain a military force the longest. Now, note that one of the very first things that Mike Johnson did when he became Speaker of the House was he separated the bill to fund the war in Israel from the bill to fund the war in Ukraine. The White House wants these to be joined, because any bill that involves funding for Israel is a bill that most Democrats and Republicans are going to vote for no matter what. And they know that's the only way they can get funding for Ukraine to pass the House. But if you separate them, as Mike Johnson did, then you have one vote on sending billions of dollars to Israel, which of course will pass. Israel always gets what it wants in Washington. And then you have a separate bill for the $60 billion for Ukraine. And that's much more difficult. And that's why Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell, along with Lindsey Graham and many, many others in the Senate, are working to rejoin these bills, knowing that that's the only chance they have to get this funding for Ukraine, this additional $60 billion, by forcing people to vote for it because it's attached to the spending bill for Israel. Here the NBC article goes on, quote, neither side is making large strides on the battlefield, which some U.S. officials now describe as a war of inches. Officials also have privately said Ukraine likely only has until the end of the year or shortly thereafter before more urgent discussions about peace negotiations should begin. U.S. officials have shared their views on such a timeline with European allies, officials said. Public sentiment toward assisting Ukraine is also starting to soften in Europe. I mean, this is the West doing what it always does. Vowing, we will be with you until the very end. You have everything you need from us. Don't worry. Keep fighting. Enter this war head first. You're going to win. We're going to give you everything you need. And then when the U.S. gets tired of the war, when the U.S. doesn't feel like spending money anymore, when public opinion turns against it, when the U.S. has a new shiny war to go fight, as they do now in the Middle East, then, sorry, time's up. Time to go negotiate with the Russians about how much of your country you're going to give them. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.